This video will cover the U.S. Capitol Police. I'm Nicholas, and you're watching the Law Enforcement Agency Information Channel. The U.S. Capitol Police is a independent, full-service, civilian-staffed, uniformed United States federal law enforcement agency that falls under the legislative branch of the U.S. federal government. The U.S. Capitol Police is arguably one of the most unique federal law enforcement agencies in the U.S., considering that it is one of the few federal law enforcement agencies in the U.S. That operates in a manner that essentially imitates the duties of a local police department. As when I get into their responsibilities later, you will most likely notice the similarities in their actual responsibilities when compared to your average local police department. But they are also unique because they are the only full-service federal law enforcement agency within the legislative branch of the U.S. federal government. But when it comes to their responsibilities, the U.S. Capitol Police is primarily responsible for protecting and policing buildings and facilities owned or operated by the U.S. Capitol Complex. And the U.S. Capitol Complex, for those who don't know, is essentially a group of approximately 17 buildings that are basically owned and occupied by Congress. And yes, you heard me right. There are 17 buildings of the U.S. Capitol Complex. Many people forget this. Many people think the U.S. Capitol Police is only meant to protect the Capitol and that there are 2,000 officers. Like, for example, many people will say, oh, why do they have 2,000 officers just for one Capitol, for one building? Well, it's not true. While most of their officers do protect the Capitol, they also protect other buildings. In fact, like I said, there are 17 buildings owned by the Capitol Complex. Of course, the U.S. Capitol is the biggest of them, but there are also other buildings. Additionally, in addition to that, the U.S. Capitol Police, as I will go into later, is also responsible for protecting members of Congress. So, again, their responsibility is not just protecting the actual U.S. Capitol, even though that is one of their main responsibilities. Yeah, when it comes to their individual duties and everyday duties. Most of them overlap or regard the enforcement of federal and local laws. They are authorized to enforce federal and local laws. When it comes to enforcing state laws, again, they generally operate within Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. is not in a U.S. state, nor is a U.S. state, so it operates as a locality. So generally they enforce federal and local laws, but when they are outside the U.S. When they are outside Washington, D.C., they may also enforce state laws if authorized to do so by the respective state's government. So when it comes to their duties, some specific duties include providing 24/7 physical security, law enforcement, and emergency services to buildings and facilities of the U.S. Capitol Complex, responding to emergencies at or nearby buildings of the U.S. Capitol Complex, investigating crimes taken on the U.S. Capitol Complex or against members of Congress, collaborating with fellow law enforcement agencies, especially during specialized operations, criminal investigations, neighborhood patrol operations, special events, and task forces, much more. In addition to that, the U.S. Capitol Police, like I said, I would bring up, is also responsible for protecting members of Congress. For those who don't know, Congress is composed of the House of Representatives and the U.S. and the U.S. Senate. So they protect both U.S. representatives and U.S. senators. But also, again, nonpartisan officers too. In addition to that, because Congress is not only full of the House of Representatives and the Senate, even though they make up the majority of Congress, they also have nonpartisan officers like the architect for the Capitol. When it comes to, again, the security of Congress, members of Congress, they assign special agents to do so. Like most agencies, usually investigative positions are responsible for security roles, as I probably highlighted in my earlier videos too. But that's pretty much it for their main responsibilities and individual duties. The U.S. Capitol Police was established in 1828 by an act of Congress, the same act that expanded the MPD's jurisdiction over the U.S. Capitol. Now, while there have been people guarding the U.S. Capitol throughout history, this was the first time the U.S. Capitol got its own official federal police force explicitly for it. The U.S. Capitol Police was founded under the authority of the Commissioner of Public Housing, and upon the time of its establishment, only had approximately 3 to 4 officers. The U.S. Capitol Police was founded in 1828 with the sole responsibility of protecting the U.S. Capitol and surrounding grounds. However, over the years, its responsibilities and duties have expanded from just protecting the U.S. Capitol to protecting multiple buildings of the entire U.S. Capitol complex. Additionally, in around the late 1900s, the U.S. Capitol Police began protecting members of Congress, including U.S. senators and U.S. representatives. Today, it is the primary law enforcement agency within the legislative branch of the U.S. federal government. In 1994, the U.S. Capitol Police's first female officer was hired. In 2001, in response to the September 11th attacks, the U.S. Capitol Police increased its security for the U.S. Capitol and members of Congress who were believed to be the intended targets of Flight 93, of the perpetrators of the attacks on Flight 93, if it wasn't for the brave citizens on board who intervened and prevented the terrorists from reaching their intended target. Additionally, ever since the September 11th attacks, the U.S. Capitol Police has joined the Joint Terrorism Task Force, the newly found Joint Terrorism Task Force, and has worked with them ever since. Their most famous case regarding the Joint Terrorism Task Force was the U.S. Capitol attacks. Ever since the U.S. Capitol attacks, the U.S. Capitol Police has worked much more strongly and coordinated much more with the Joint Terrorism Task Force than it had in previous years. But in 2005, in 2005, the U.S. Capitol Police's Office of Inspector General, the U.S. Capitol Police's Office of Inspector General was established after a order from Congress. But then later on, in around, I believe it was, 2009, the Library of Congress Police, a former federal law enforcement agency charged with protecting the Library of Congress and important members of the Library of Congress, such as the Librarian of Congress, was merged with the U.S. Capitol Police, or absorbed by the U.S. Capitol Police, which furthermore increased the U.S. Capitol Police's total jurisdiction, responsibilities, and employee count, and of course geographical area too. Nowadays, they not only protect nowadays they not only protect the U.S. Capitol complex, but also, or I'm pretty sure nowadays they protect. I'm pretty sure nowadays the Library of Congress is a part of the U.S. Capitol complex, but anyways, nowadays the U.S. Capitol Police protects the Library of Congress and its officials. But then in 2021, which was probably the most devastating part of the U.S. Capitol Police's history, the January 6th attacks occurred, or the U.S. Capitol attacks, and essentially the attacks have led to the killing, or it led to multiple deaths, but also injuries. It led over 174 police officers to being killed or injured. Of course, the majority of which being from the U.S. Capitol Police and Washington, D.C. Metropolitan Police, considering those were the two primary agencies that responded and were seen at the U.S. Capitol attacks. It led to massive security changes, but it also led the U.S. Capitol Police to increase its employee count. Nowadays, on the bright side, the U.S. Capitol Police has over 2,000 employees, which is a significant change from previous years. In fact, it is a approximately 43% increase from their employee count before the U.S. Capitol tax, which is a pretty big change. So, yeah. Unlike most federal law enforcement agencies, the U.S. Capitol Police falls under the legislative branch of the U.S. federal government and therefore reports to Congress. The U.S. Capitol Police is overseen by the U.S. Capitol Police Board, which is a group of three congressional officials: the Sergeant at Arms of the U.S. Senate, the Sergeant at Arms of the U.S. House of Representatives, and the Architect of the Capitol. Now, these three congressional officials each represent one of the U.S. Capitol Police's primary responsibilities. The Architect of the Capitol represents the U.S. Capitol Police's primary responsibility, which is protecting the physical property and architecture of the U.S. Capitol and surrounding grounds of the U.S. Capitol complex, and any building and facility owned by the U.S. Capitol complex. So, the Sergeant at Arms of the U.S. Senate, they represent the U.S. Capitol Police's responsibility to protect U.S. senators, which are members of Congress. So they also represent the U.S. Capitol Police's responsibility. They also represent the U.S. Capitol Police's responsibilities to protect certain nonpartisan officers of Congress. The Sergeant at Arms of the U.S. House of Representatives. They represent the U.S. Capitol Police's responsibility to protect U.S. representatives who are, of course, members of Congress and certain nonpartisan officers of the U.S. Capitol. So each of them represent one of their responsibilities. But with that being said, the U.S. Capitol Police Board, they really oversee. I mean, technically, actually, the U.S. Capitol Police, I should clarify this, they technically report to the U.S. Capitol Police Board. However, the U.S. Capitol Police Board reports to Congress. So, indirectly or directly, the U.S. Capitol Police does report to Congress. The rank structure of the U.S. Capitol Police from high to low is in the following order: Chief of Police, Assistant Chief of Police, Chief of Operations, Deputy Chief of Police, Inspector, Captain, Lieutenant, Sergeant, and finally entry-level employee. The U.S. Capitol Police is broken down into bureaus and offices, which can further be broken down into units, which can further be broken down into subunits. These bureaus and offices include the Uniformed Services Bureau, the Protective Services Bureau, the Operational Services Bureau, the Security Services Bureau, the Intelligence Services Bureau, the Training Services Bureau, the Command and Coordination Bureau, the Office of the Inspector General, the Office of Professional Responsibility, the Office of Inspections and Policy, the Office of Human Resources, the Office of Acquisition Management, the Office of Financial Management, the Office of the Chief of Staff, the Office of the General Counsel, the Office of Background Information and Credentializing, the Office of Information Services, and lastly, the Office of Logistical Services. U.S. Capitol Police officers have authority to carry firearms, issue warrantless arrests, and carry out warrants both on duty and off duty throughout their respective jurisdiction. Speaking of which, the U.S. Capitol Police has domestic-wide jurisdiction throughout the United States and its individual territories to protect members of Congress. Now, when I say protect members of Congress, as I will get into later, I not only mean directly, but also indirectly. So this not only would include directly providing security details to Congress members, but also investigating and pursuing threats towards Congress members. But yeah, I'll get into that later too. And it's also important to note that any crime taken within a building or facility of the U.S. Capitol complex is considered a crime against Congress, because whether the crime is taken intentionally or unintentionally against Congress, either way, it disrupts the duties of Congress. So, I mean, if for example, if there's a car crash nearby the U.S. Capitol or at the U.S. Capitol even, that still does disrupt the duties of Congress, because think about it. I mean, yeah, it either way it does disrupt the duties of Congress. But with that being said, when not protecting members of Congress, the U.S. Capitol Police generally is supposed to stick to its primary jurisdiction, which is the U.S. Capitol complex, and surrounding grounds. So yeah, that is their primary jurisdiction. But yeah, again, they have overall domestic wide jurisdiction to protect members of Congress. However, despite what the U.S. Code has explicitly highlighted, um, and how Congress has highlighted it very clearly, people still question U.S. Capitol Police's jurisdiction to this day. For example, in the aftermath of the January 6 U.S. Capitol attacks, the U.S. Capitol Police established a field office. I think it was around 2022, and the U.S. Capitol Police, specifically its Protective Services Bureau, established a field office in Tampa, Florida, to investigate threats towards Congress, which were rising heavily at the time. Now, I know what you're thinking. Why Tampa out of all cities? Well, it's essentially because many of the threats that were coming towards Congress were originating from Tampa, which is not that surprising considering Tampa is Florida in general actually is a primarily Republican state, and Tampa is definitely a Republican city, so it makes sense why many of those threats were originating from there. But of course, local residents, they did not really like their presence there. Many of them argued that the U.S. Capitol Police was outside their jurisdiction, that they had to stick to Washington D.C. and that they didn't have jurisdiction, outside it. But my professional opinion, let me put this out, and many others have stated this too. U.S. Capitol Police does have jurisdiction in Tampa, as what they are doing is explicitly within their duties. They, as clearly highlighted by the U.S. Code, the U.S. Code clearly highlights that the U.S. Capitol Police may operate anywhere throughout the United States and its individual territories to protect members of Congress. Now, whether that's directly or indirectly doesn't matter, because they didn't specify that. And therefore, investigating threats towards Congress in Tampa is still within their jurisdiction, because technically, of course, Tampa is within the U.S., and in addition to that, they are protecting members of Congress by investigating threats towards them. So technically, they are within their jurisdiction by protecting members of Congress, just indirectly. So yeah, I mean, that's they've also established other field offices, like in San Francisco. They plan to establish others too, but currently there are two field offices outside of Washington D.C. are Tampa, Florida, and is the one in Tampa, Florida, and in San Francisco. The U.S. Capitol Police, it derives its jurisdiction and authority from Title II, Title II, Chapter 29, Section 1961 of the U.S. Code. U.S. Capitol Police officers train for approximately 25 to 26 weeks. There are two phases of U.S. Capitol Police training. The first phase is known as initial training or entry-level training, and takes approximately 12 to 13 weeks, and is located at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, or FLETC for short, in Glencoe, Georgia. Now, the first phase focuses much more broadly. It covers general policing tactics. So this includes tactics like physical tactics, firearm tactics, fugitive apprehension and arrest tactics, emergency vehicle tactics, and criminal law. The second phase is kind of the opposite. It is much more agency specific. The second phase is known as in-house training. Is known as the in-house training phase, and it takes approximately 13 weeks and is located at the U.S. Capitol Police Academy, a FLETA certified academy located in Cheltenham, Maryland. The reason why it is actually known as the in-house training phase is because it takes place directly at the U.S. Capitol Police Academy. But again, the second phase of their training focuses much more on agency-specific tactics. So it'll have courses covering things like, physical security tactics for the Capitol and Congress, special event security tactics, and much more. Additionally, in the past few years after the U.S. Capitol attacks, the U.S. Capitol Police Academy has also added crowd control methods to their training. So nowadays you'll see officers also undergoing those tactics too. But again, there are many tactics covered in those 13 weeks of the second phase of training. Those are just a few examples. If you're wondering whether you get paid during U.S. Capitol Police training, the answer is yes, you are paid during U.S. Capitol Police training. The U.S. Capitol Police training, the U.S. Capitol Police Academy is actually arguably very similar to the U.S. Secret Service Academy, except for a few things. The first thing is that the U.S. Secret Service Academy is significantly more harder and rigorous. It requires during U.S. Secret Service training, they cover things. They require their officers to prepare for things and train for things like dodging a bullet for the president, life-risking things. You will not see U.S. Capitol Police officers being trained in those kind of things during their training. Their U.S. Capitol Police training is much more relaxed. While they do train their officers to protect members of Congress, they do not make them train to dodge a bullet for them. Those are like life-risking things. They don't do that, unlike the Secret Service does for the president. Which makes sense because the president has a much more significant status in the federal government. It makes sense why they focus on that kind of stuff and the Capitol Police doesn't. So yeah. But on the other side, on the pro side, U.S. Secret Service special agents are actually paid much better than Capitol Police officers. So there is a pro side to having harder training, they're paid much better. In fact, the U.S. Secret Service, I believe, is one of the highest paying, if not the highest paying federal law enforcement agencies in the U.S. They have very high salaries. Anyways, when it comes to when it comes to their requirements, the requirements to become a U.S. Capitol Police officer, there are a few requirements. Again, general requirements similar to that of a municipal police department. So requirements like, for example, you must be a U.S. citizen. So you must have active U.S. citizenship. You must have clear history, so no past criminal records whatsoever, as they will conduct a background check on you. You also must be between the ages of 21 and 39. You must be registered within the Selective Service System. If you don't register within the Selective Service System, it's actually pretty much a felony, federal felony, and so you are required to do that. That is a part of the background check. But of course, if you're a woman, you are exempt from the selective service system. So they would just mark you off for that. Not mark you off, but they would check you off for that. You have to either be registered in the selective service system or exempt from the selective service system. And again, that is a part of the full background check they conduct on you. Additionally, you must have a relatively good driving history, and maintain an active driving license. So again, that is also a part of the background check they will conduct on you. And then in addition to that, last thing, you are required to have at the very least a general education diploma or GED. That is the very basic requirements. Having more is even better, but that is the very basic requirements. If you're planning to become a special agent within the U.S. Capitol Police, the requirements might be higher. They might require a bachelor's degree or something. This is just general requirements for becoming a U.S. Capitol Police officer. But yeah, that's pretty much it for their training and requirements. The U.S. Capitol Police works with multiple law enforcement agencies from federal, state, to local. They have participated in multiple task forces throughout the past, including the Joint Terrorism Task Force, the Inaugural Task Force, and multiple others. However, on a day-to-day basis, they can be seen most frequently working with agencies like the MPD, USPP, USSS, and multiple other agencies. The U.S. Capitol Police plays a significant role in security during presidential inaugurations. It is actually along with the FBI and the U.S. Secret Service, one of the primary law enforcement agencies in planning out security measures for and providing security for presidential inaugurations. They are one of the lead agencies. But the U.S. Capitol Police, in specific, focuses on the planning out security measures for members of Congress. So not only the U.S. Capitol, where the presidential inauguration takes place, but also the members of Congress attending it. The Secret Service, on the other hand, focuses on the Secret Service, on the other hand, they focus on ensuring the security of course, the president and other executive officials, such as the vice president, and pretty much any important executive official attending, so they focus on security measures for them. But the FBI, they don't really. I mean, they focus, of course, on the security of the president and members of Congress, but they focus more broadly on preventing terrorism and potential terrorism. So they are very well aware before this. It's an entire task force that is actually responsible for security during presidential inaugurations. The U.S. Capitol Police, FBI, and U.S. Secret Service are just one of the three main agencies. But yeah, the FBI, they focus on really ensuring, of course, they focus on ensuring security during the events, but more broadly preventing any national security threats like terrorism, and ensuring security for the U.S. Capitol too. But again, this is an entire task force and that's responsible for security during presidential inaugurations. It is actually one of the largest task forces, or not the largest, but is pretty large. It's known as the Inaugural Task Force or the Inaugural Security Task Force. It's led by the U.S. Secret Service, of course, because the presidential inauguration, the president is the main figure in the presidential inauguration. So, of course, the Secret Service would lead it. But the Secret Service leads it. There are many agencies. I believe there was around 180 law enforcement agencies involved in security during presidential inaugurations. So, just to list a few, these would include of course, U.S. Capitol Police, FBI, the U.S. Secret Service, of course, the U.S. Park Police, the U.S. Mint Police, the Bureau of Engraving and Printing Police, the Washington, D.C. Protective Services Division, the Virginia State Police, just trying to think of others. There are many law enforcement agencies involved. Not only law enforcement agencies within the Washington D.C. area, but also outside law enforcement agencies too. Like I said, the Virginia State Police it also comes and it participates in security during such events. And the reason why outside law enforcement agencies like the Virginia State Police are allowed to respond to the Washington D.C. The reason why they're allowed to respond, considering Washington D.C. of course is not in Virginia, the reason why they're allowed to respond is because of clear cooperative agreements between Washington D.C. Between basically the federal government and the state of Virginia during these presidential inaugurations. It's a very common thing. It's presidential inaugurations are pretty much one of the very few times peace officers from other states can actually respond outside their state. It's very unique. Of course, this also did happen in the U.S. Capitol attacks. The Virginia State Police responded to that too. But again, it's very rare to happen. But yeah, that's I hope that really answered the question. In addition to providing security to presidential inaugurations, the U.S. Capitol Police also provide security to presidential nominating conventions. They work heavily with the Secret Service during such events. They primarily focus on, of course, the U.S. Capitol Police primarily focuses on the security of Congress members during such events. However, they also do very frequently just work with and coordinate with the Secret Service on, any event threats. And they are generally responsible for everyone within the stadium. However, they primarily focus on Congress members within the stadium. So they just provide security to the entire stadium, so that way, everyone's safe, but especially Congress. That's pretty much it for that. Yeah. To answer the question, why is the U.S. Capitol Police considered a federal law enforcement agency, but the MPD is not, if both were established by Congress? The real answer is because the U.S. Capitol Police, on one hand, while both were established by Congress, the U.S. Capitol Police was explicitly established by Congress under the authority and control of the legislative branch of the U.S. federal government. The MPD, on the other hand, the Congress established the MPD under the control of the government of the District of Columbia, the city government of the District of Columbia, which is why the U.S. Capitol Police is a federal law enforcement agency, and the MPD is a municipal law enforcement agency, because the U.S. Capitol Police is operating under the federal government, while the MPD was operating under the municipal level government. But there are also some other factors that you can determine in. For example, Congress explicitly gives the U.S. Capitol Police authority to, protect the U.S. Capitol and protect members of Congress nationwide. That those kind of things, they're not really given to municipal law enforcement agencies. Congress only gives those kind of powers to federal law enforcement agencies. Again, nationwide arrest powers, though, that's a federal law enforcement agency generally. I don't think there is any law enforcement agency that's not federal that has nationwide arrest powers. Yeah, that's the real main reason. The main factual reason why the U.S. Capitol Police is federal law enforcement, while the MPD is not, is because the U.S. Capitol Police, they were established under the federal government, while the MPD was established under the municipal government of the District of Columbia. So, yeah. To answer the question, does the MPD have jurisdiction over the U.S. Capitol? The answer is yes. The MPD does technically have jurisdiction over the U.S. Capitol as granted by Congress. However, it's a non-concept because they can only enter the U.S. Capitol and enforce laws within the U.S. Capitol under the direct consent or request of the U.S. Capitol's primary law enforcement agency, which is the U.S. Capitol Police. So, in other words, they are allowed or able to, they do have jurisdiction within the U.S. Capitol, but they can only actually exercise their powers in the U.S. Capitol when granted by Congress, when granted by the U.S. Capitol Police, more specifically the U.S. Capitol Police Board. It must be directly from the U.S. Capitol Police Board. Instances where this has happened throughout the past include during presidential inaugurations. They've also in the U.S. Capitol tax, the MPD, of course, was requested, so they were able to respond there. And multiple other instances. Pretty much in any emergency, major emergency, generally the U.S. Capitol Police will seek assistance from the MPD, and there is no problem with doing so. They as long as they get direct request, they get direct consent or request from the U.S. Capitol Police, they are allowed to respond. Yeah, that's pretty much it. Yeah. Why did the U.S. Capitol Police not respond to the U.S. Capitol attacks if they were already nearby? This is a very common question, and the real answer to it is because while they were, of course, located in Washington, D.C., and were nearby where the Capitol attacks were located, were taking place, they didn't respond because it wasn't within their main priorities, nor responsibilities. They really, nor case jurisdiction either. Their priority as a federal executive law enforcement agency is, of course, their priority is protecting the president and other important executive officials. The U.S. Capitol, it's not home to any federal executive officials. It's home to federal legislative officials, and it is a federal legislative building. So therefore, it wasn't within their priority to respond. While they could have technically, and I'm guessing they did most likely send a few units, but they wouldn't respond. They wouldn't respond with their entire force because it's simply not. It's not their priority. If anything, their priority at that time is protecting the president. That is their priority, not protecting Congress, because that is the U.S. Capitol Police's job. But of course, now I know you're probably also thinking if the president, because of course President Trump, he incited that insurrection at the Capitol. So doesn't that mean the U.S. Secret Service has jurisdiction over it because the president incited it? Well, it's not that simple because the U.S. Secret Service, they're responsible for, again, protecting federal executive officials. They don't investigate crimes really taken by federal executive officials. I mean, unless it is the U.S. Secret Service's director. But no, they don't typically investigate crimes taken directly by federal executive officials. They are responsible for protecting them, not investigating corruption taken by them. That is the job of the FBI. And the FBI actually did respond to the U.S. Capitol attacks. In fact, the reason why Trump hates the FBI is because, or at least used to hate the FBI, is because they were the ones conducting the investigations into him after the U.S. Capitol attack. So you could think of the U.S. Secret Service as the president's friend, while the FBI is more of the president's enemy of sorts. For the question, how can the U.S. Capitol Police fall under the legislative branch if law enforcement is typically handled by the executive branch? And the real answer is because it's not really as simple as that. Again, you probably heard that the executive branch is the only branch that does law enforcement. That's not really true. Other branches can also do law enforcement. It's just not their main priority. The executive branch is a primary branch for enforcing laws. That is literally their duty. So that is why there is this very common rumor that the executive branch is the only branch that has law enforcement, but it's not. Other branches can have law enforcement components if it is explicitly for protecting members of their branch, investigating corruption within their branch, or like conducting branch-related enforcement duties. For example, the U.S. Capitol Police, their job is not unlike the FBI or the U.S. Marshal Service. They are not really direct enforcers. They're more there to, of course, protect the Capitol and Congress. They are more of a protective law enforcement agency rather than a direct enforcing. They just focus much more on protecting the U.S. Capitol and Congress rather than civil law enforcement duties like the FBI, U.S. Marshal Service, and CIS that they do. That's pretty much it for that. Yeah.